The first drone hit the ground with a hollow crack, plastic and metal scattering through the tall grass like startled birds. I lowered the shotgun slowly, the echo of the blast still hanging in the quiet afternoon air. For a moment, everything was still. Then the shouting started. "What the hell did you do?" Karen's voice tore across the fence line before I even turned around. She was standing at the gate, face flushed, remote controller clenched in her hand as if it might somehow rewind the last 30 seconds. "Why did you shoot down my drones?" Another broken rotor spun lazily in the dirt behind me. I rested the shotgun against my shoulder and looked at her the same way I had a dozen times before. Calm, steady, already tired of the argument. "Karen," I said, "I warned you." Her mouth opened like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. But warnings only matter when someone decides to listen. And Karen never did. What she saw today looked sudden. To me, it was inevitable. A few months earlier, none of this even seemed possible. When I bought the farm, I wasn't chasing drama, and I definitely wasn't looking for a fight with anyone. What I wanted was simple. Quiet mornings, honest work. The kind of place where the loudest sound most days was the wind moving through the grass or a tractor starting up before sunrise. The property itself was exactly what I had been looking for. Wide open land, an old barn that still smelled like wood and hay, and enough distance from the city to finally breathe again. After years of noise, traffic, and neighbors stacked wall to wall, the silence felt like something you could actually hold on to. Technically, my land sat right beside a polished suburban neighborhood. Perfect rows of houses, trimmed hedges, matching mailboxes lined up like soldiers. It looked orderly. Almost picture perfect. The kind of place run by one of those homeowner associations that care deeply about lawns and appearances. But my property wasn't part of it. Different deed. Different rules. At least, that's what I thought when I first moved in. Back then, the days were calm, the nights were quiet, and the only thing crossing my fields were deer and the occasional wandering breeze. Karen appeared about 2 weeks after I moved in. It was a bright afternoon, the kind where the sun sits high, and everything feels slow and predictable. I was repairing a loose board on the barn when I noticed a white SUV pulling up to the front gate. The door opened and out stepped a woman dressed like she were headed to a garden party instead of a farm. She walked up to the fence with a confident smile and oversized sunglasses, carrying a folder tucked neatly under her arm. "You must be the new owner," she said brightly. "I'm Karen, president of the HOA next door." Before I could say much, she launched into a speech. Rules about property appearance, acceptable noise levels, landscaping standards, and community expectations poured out of her like she had rehearsed them 100 times. It sounded less like a conversation and more like someone reading off a script. I listened patiently until she paused for breath. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I appreciate you introducing yourself, but this property isn't part of the HOA. I never signed any agreement with your association." For a second, her smile froze in place. "Oh," she said slowly, tilting her head as she had just heard something mildly amusing. "That's not really how things work around here." I explained again, politely but clearly, that my land was independent and outside their jurisdiction. Her tone shifted almost immediately. The friendliness stayed on the surface, but something colder settled underneath it. "Well," she said with a thin smile, "cooperation usually makes life easier for everyone." A few days after that conversation, the first letter showed up in my mailbox. It was printed on thick paper with the HOA's logo stamped across the top like some kind of official notice. According to Karen, my property was now under review for several violations. Improper fencing, excessive equipment visibility, agricultural activity that supposedly disturbed the visual harmony of the neighborhood. I read it twice before setting it down on the kitchen table. The strange part wasn't the accusations. It was the confidence behind them, like she genuinely believed the rules of her neighborhood somehow stretched across my fence line. So I responded the same way I handle most problems on a farm, calmly and in writing. I sent a short letter back explaining that my land was not part of the association, never had been, and legally couldn't be governed by their bylaws. I figured that would settle things. Instead, the next envelope arrived 4 days later, then another. Each one is longer than the last. Complaints about my tractor being visible from the road, claims that my livestock might intimidate residents. One letter even suggested that my barn disrupted the aesthetic balance of the surrounding homes. It would have been funny if it weren't so persistent. Then the neighborhood started getting involved. Cars began slowing down near my driveway, sometimes stopping for a moment longer than normal. I'd look up from the field and notice someone holding a phone out the window, pretending they were just checking directions. They weren't. Karen wasn't just sending letters anymore. She was building a narrative, one complaint at a time, hoping pressure would eventually make me fold. The strange part was how confident she seemed about the outcome. The first time I heard the buzzing, I'd barely paid attention. Out in the countryside, strange sounds happen all the time. Equipment hums, insects drone through the summer air, and sometimes kids from nearby neighborhoods fly those little toy drones just to see how far they can push them. So when I looked up and spotted a small machine hovering above the barn for a few seconds, I assumed it was nothing more than curiosity drifting a little too far. But the next afternoon it happened again. Same faint buzzing, same slow movement above the property. This time the drone stayed longer, tilting slightly as if studying the ground below. When I stepped out into the open field and waved my arm, it didn't drift randomly like a toy. It backed away in a straight line and disappeared over the trees separating my land from the neighborhood. That's when the pattern started forming. Every afternoon, almost the same time, the buzzing returned. The drone would hover near the barn, glide over the tractor shed, then circle once above the pasture before leaving. Always watching, always recording. After about a week, the quiet sky changed again. One afternoon, there weren't one, but 3 drones hovering over the fields, spaced out as someone had carefully positioned them. Cameras angled downward, steady and deliberate. That was the moment the harmless explanation finally ran out. Kids don't fly drones like that. And they definitely don't send a small fleet. Karen wasn't just complaining anymore, she was watching. The afternoon had finally crossed the line looked ordinary at first. The sky was clear, the fields quiet, and I was halfway through checking a fence post near the pasture when the familiar buzzing returned. I glanced up out of habit, expecting the usual single drone drifting over the barn. Instead, there were 4. They hovered in different corners of the property like someone had planned it that way. One above the barn, one near the tractor shed, another slowly circling the pasture, and the last hanging almost directly above me. Their cameras tilted downward, steady and deliberate, like silent observers waiting to catch something useful. I stood there for a moment, watching them the same way you watch a storm rolling in, because by then I understood something Karen clearly didn't. Warnings only work when someone respects them. I had already sent letters. I had already told her directly that the surveillance needed to stop. None of it mattered. So I walked back toward the house, opened the storage cabinet by the door, and lifted the shotgun I used for predators that wandered too close to the livestock. When I stepped back into the field, the buzzing was still there. The first shot echoed across the land. One drone dropped instantly, spinning into the grass. Then another. Then another. Karen didn't waste time turning the situation into a lawsuit. Within a week, papers arrived claiming I had destroyed private property and acted with reckless hostility. According to her version of the story, the drones were harmless tools and I had overreacted. She walked into court looking confident, as the ending had already been decided in her favor. But courtrooms don't run on confidence. They run on facts. My lawyer presented everything. The letters she sent demanding authority she never had. The timestamps show the drones hovering over my property day after day. The photos documenting their position above barns, equipment, and pasture land clearly outside the HOA's reach. Piece by piece, the picture became impossible to ignore. The judge didn't take long. Karen's claims were dismissed, and the warning was direct. Stop interfering with property that doesn't belong to the association. Karen stormed out, furious. I went home to the same quiet farm I had wanted from the start.